Beneath Morocco's mountains, deserts and windswept plains lie vast stone rings, vanished cities, rock-cut fortresses, and ancient human traces that seem far older, more deliberate, and more interconnected than their isolated locations should allow, each one defying the timelines and purposes we've long accepted. Their foundations don't match the civilizations credited with building them. Their alignments suggest intentions no record explains, and their origins keep slipping beyond the reach of mainstream archaeology, as if an earlier chapter of humanity was written here and then quietly erased. So who shaped these structures before history began? What knowledge moved across these landscapes long before empire and script? And why do these distant sites echo one another as though remembering the same forgotten world? Ait Benhaddou. Beneath the slow drift of dust rising from the edge of the Unila Valley, Ait Benhaddou settles into the landscape with a composure that suggests it has always been here, its stepped towers and earthen walls appearing less built than grown from the desert itself. And yet, the silence around its foundations hints at an origin more layered than the Kasbah's familiar profile implies, as though the fortified Khazar were the final expression of a story whose earliest chapters remain obscured behind the deep ochre of its rammed earth facade. And when morning light grazes the angles of its granaries, dwellings, and defensive ramparts, it illuminates the traces of successive hands that shaped these clustered forms, from pre-Saharan caravans carrying salt and gold, to later dynasties consolidating control over trade routes that once braided the Maghreb into the economies of the Sahel and the Mediterranean, each era leaving behind structural signatures that archaeologists attempt to parse. Variations in pisse composition, subtle changes in timber bonding, shifts in courtyard arrangement, yet even these practical clues only sketch the outline of a settlement whose earliest footprint may predate the fortress identity it is known for today. As excavations along the riverbank reveal lenses of occupation soil and fragmented pottery that span centuries, the settlement's growth begins to appear as a slow accretion rather than a singular construction, and questions arise about whether an earlier, less formalized community first clustered near this vantage point overlooking seasonal water, choosing the slope for its defensible height and for the way the valley narrows into a natural corridor, a geographic constraint that once funneled travelers through a choke point, which would have offered both opportunity and risk to those living here. And while surviving chronicles tie Ait Benhaddou to the Almoravid and later Glaoui influence, the proportions of certain towers and the alignment of the Khazar's primary gateway suggest architectural habits that resemble fortified villages farther east, raising the possibility that migrant groups or regional masons shared techniques across wide distances long before the site became a node of trans-Saharan commerce. Though the evidence remains partial, and interpretations vary as scholars debate microscopic inclusions in the mud brick that might link one structure to a specific period of construction. Meanwhile, the Kasbah's defensive silhouette, which appears so uniform from afar, dissolves on closer approach into a collage of repairs, expansions, blocked passages, and repurposed storage rooms, each alteration hinting at changing political and environmental pressures, flood episodes leaving sediment high against lower walls, episodes of instability prompting the heightening of parapets, long spells of drought pushing residents to reconfigure cistern systems so that runoff could be trapped rather than lost to the riverbed. And these cumulative adaptations complicate attempts to establish a clean evolutionary sequence. For the Khazar behaves less like a static monument and more like a living architectural organism shaped by necessity, opportunity, and time. Yet within this dynamic history lie small inconsistencies that continue to draw quiet curiosity. The deep-set niches carved into older wall sections, whose purpose remains ambiguous, too shallow for storage, but too intentionally formed to be decorative. The faint traces of a foundation trench under the southern cluster that seems to belong to a structure with a different orientation than the rest of the Khazar. The presence of pottery styles that hint at trade links predating the site's recognized mercantile prominence, and the unusual uniformity of brick material in one elevated sector, as if a coordinated building effort once took place under conditions that differ from the incremental development suggested elsewhere. None of these anomalies are dramatic enough to overturn established timelines, yet together they create a gentle friction between what is documented and what is implied, prompting questions about whether Ait Benhaddou emerged gradually from local adaptation, or whether an earlier, more organized settlement phase existed whose traces are now faint, overwritten by centuries of replastering and reconfiguration. And as researchers sift through soil layers and historical accounts, they note how the Khazar's commanding position mirrors patterns found in other Maghrebi highland fortifications that once mediated movement between interior plateaus and coastal basins, suggesting that this valley may have carried regional significance long before caravans made it a known waypoint, its topography guiding human occupation through channels now obscured by later. Historical narratives. The sediment cores taken near the river reveal fluctuations in climate that might have driven periods of abandonment and reoccupation, leaving open the possibility that the site experienced cycles of presence that do not align neatly with surviving written references. And this uneven continuity raises a subtle question about which chapter of the Khazar's long existence is the one modern observers most readily see, whether the towering granaries we admire are an apex or merely one peak in a longer, more nuanced sequence of habitation. And while no evidence points to unfamiliar civilizations or forgotten cultures, the slight divergences in construction logic whisper of influences not yet fully traced. Movements of people whose identities remain unrecorded, but whose practical knowledge left its mark in the thickness of load-bearing walls, the strategic clustering of family compounds, and the calculated positioning of observation points carved into upper terraces. In this way, the megastructure stands not as a puzzle demanding a single answer, but as a palimpsest of decisions made over generations, each decision responding to forces both seen and unseen by those who now study it. And as the evening wind sweeps between the towers and settles the dust back into the cracks of the old pathways, the Khazar seems to retreat once more into its own quiet, revealing only what the shifting light allows, inviting the possibility that somewhere beneath its successive layers lies a missing fragment of human settlement history. Not a lost civilization, but a subtle, earlier stage of community making whose contours remain partly concealed, leaving Ait Benhaddou poised between what is known and what may yet be clarified by the next small discovery waiting in the valley's patient earth. Volubilis. Along the gently rising plain, where the Middle Atlas gives way to rolling farmland, the ruins of Volubilis rest in measured rows of stone that catch the sun with an almost reflective stillness, their shattered columns and mosaic floors seeming less like remnants of a distant empire than the exposed interior of a long-forgotten conversation between cultures. For although the site is remembered as one of Rome's westernmost administrative centres, its foundations stretch deeper into a past where Mauritanian settlement patterns shaped the earliest contours of urban life. And in the shifting contrast between the orderly Roman grid and the subtler traces beneath it, lies an unresolved thread that continues to draw archaeological attention. The city's triumphal arch rises cleanly against the sky, a lasting emblem of imperial reach, yet around it low fragments of walls, aligned at unexpected angles, hint at pre-Roman phases whose architectural logic differs from the formulaic layouts imposed later, suggesting a place that adapted itself repeatedly to changing political tides, each period adding layers rather than erasing what came before, creating a composite urban organism whose complexity resists simple classification. And as excavators work their way through the remains of olive presses, baths, basilicas, and domestic quarters, they encounter soil sequences that preserve hints of older habitation. Fine hearth ash, locally made ceramics with patterns distinct from imported ware, and post holes marking structures whose form is still only partially understood. While subtle shifts in the city's orientation toward the valley reveal efforts to reconcile pre-existing settlement patterns with the demanding geometry of Roman planning, a tension preserved in the irregular edges where streets meet earlier property lines. Historians chronicle how Volubilis flourished through agriculture and trade, its prosperity rooted in fertile soils and a strategic position along routes linking inland communities with coastal markets. Yet the persistence of certain building styles long after Roman incorporation hints at a population that retained local influences, shaping their environment in ways that complicate assumptions of broad cultural replacement. And this interplay of external order and internal continuity fosters questions about how identity evolved within these stones. Water channels running beneath the old avenues reveal repairs and realignments from different generations, each phase responding to environmental fluctuations preserved in silt patterns. And the presence of flood deposits wedged under one colonnade suggests hydrological events that may have reshaped habitation zones, prompting residents to reinforce or abandon particular districts. Adjustments that seldom appear in surviving texts, yet remain legible in the physical record. Scattered across the site, several unfinished structures bear marks of interrupted construction. Column drums abandoned before fluting, foundations that trace the beginnings of expansion projects later halted. And while practical explanations abound, ranging from economic downturns to regional instability, their pattern raises a quieter uncertainty about the city's long-term rhythms, hinting at periods of optimism followed by abrupt constraint, each shift preserved in the incomplete geometry of stone. In one corner of the forum, a sequence of reused blocks, some bearing faint pre-Roman carvings, suggests that earlier shrines or communal spaces once stood nearby, later quarried for new civic buildings, and the faintest remnants of these original forms surface in the irregularities of wall joints and the softened contours of sculpted fragments, whose motifs no longer have clear counterparts, inviting speculation about spiritual practices and local iconographies that existed before Roman documentation reached this frontier. Mosaic floors, meticulously arranged in patterns of marine life, hunting scenes and seasonal cycles, form a vivid chapter in the visible story of Volubilis. Yet beneath some of them lie compacted occupation layers that preserve traces of earlier domestic arrangements, their fragmentary hearths and storage pits, oriented without regard for the later street grid, suggesting a residential logic attuned to climate, prevailing winds, and social cohesion rather than imperial order. And this quiet underlying architecture acts as a reminder that the city, even at its Roman height, carried memories of a deeper past. At the limits of the excavated zone, stone alignments diverge unexpectedly from the main urban layout, possibly marking agricultural enclosures or industrial spaces whose functions remain debated. And among these features lie anomalous pottery assemblages, shards that differ slightly in mineral composition, firing temperature, or decorative ink, implying contact networks or production traditions not fully incorporated into the Roman economy, though none of these differences point to anything beyond normal variation across a culturally diverse frontier. Still, taken together, they form a mosaic of subtle inconsistencies that gesture toward missing details in the narrative of how the city transformed from a local stronghold into an imperial provincial centre. Inscriptions preserved on reused slabs record names that blend Roman and indigenous elements, suggesting a community negotiating overlapping identities, and the pattern of domestic courtyards, some maintaining inward-focused Berber layouts, others embracing Roman peristyles, reveals choices that carry quiet echoes of cultural negotiation, each decision shaped by family history, environmental practicality, and evolving social norms. At sunset, when shadows lengthen across the olive groves that still follow ancient field lines, Volubilis appears suspended between eras, its stones holding both the confidence of Roman engineering and the older, softer traces of the communities that preceded it, creating an impression that the site is not merely a ruin, but a layered chronicle of human adaptation on a shifting frontier. And as modern research refines chronologies through radiocarbon analysis and microstratigraphy, the boundaries of these occupation phases become clearer, yet still retain small gaps. Intervals of unclear transition where the reasons behind expansion, contraction, or reorganization remain partly veiled, leaving room for the possibility that the most significant chapter of Volubilis' story may lie not in its monumental architecture, but in the quieter phases that shaped its origins. Thus, the city endures as a testament to the interplay of power, tradition, and landscape, its weathered stones suggesting that even in a place where so much is documented, there remains a subdued and lingering question about how the earliest inhabitants conceived this ridge overlooking the valley, and how their decisions set the foundation for all that followed, offering a gentle reminder that beneath the order of the Roman grid there may still be fragments of a more ancient pattern awaiting recognition. Lixus. Where the Atlantic wind presses inland across low hills veined with tamarisk and saltbrush, the ancient city of Lixus rises in terraces of weathered stone above the meandering Lukos River. Its scattered foundations and eroded podiums, arranged across a slope that once commanded both fertile floodplain and maritime reach. And as the morning mist thins over the estuary, the site reveals itself less as a single coherent settlement than as a layered assemblage of ambitions stretching from early Amazigh communities through Punic traders and Roman administrators, each phase imprinting new geometries onto the one before it. The surviving walls of workshops, sanctuaries, and residential quarters form a fractured outline of a city whose long life is apparent in the irregular merging of building traditions. And the faint echo of distant waves reminds visitors that Lixus once stood at the hinge between land routes and oceanic commerce, its placement suggesting a strategic insight that long predates classical descriptions. For local groups appear to have used this promontory well before external powers recognized its value. Archaeologists tracing the earlier strata encounter hearth remains and ceramics that differ subtly from later Punic imports, and though these finds are modest, their distribution hints at habitation patterns organised not around urban planning, but around seasonal resource use linked to river shifts and coastal fisheries, suggesting that Lixus began as a place of recurring presence rather than permanent stone construction. Yet as Phoenician influence spread along the coast, new architectural signatures began to accumulate. Rectilinear rooms, mud brick partitions reinforced with timber, and evidence of industrial activity related to salt and fish processing, marking a transition toward a more anchored community whose maritime orientation would eventually shape its economic identity. And still beneath this progression lie unanswered questions about exactly how interactions between indigenous inhabitants and incoming traders unfolded, their material records overlapping but not always blending, leaving scholars to interpret the nuanced interface between cultural persistence and external influence. The Roman reorganization of Lixus added another chapter, layering monumental structures and expansive industrial complexes onto the landscape. And among the most striking features are the garum factories, their deep stone vats forming a grid that descends the slope toward the river, each basin preserving residues that testify to large-scale production. Yet even within this apparent order lie small anomalies, vats of unusual dimensions, drainage channels that redirect rather than converge, and isolated outbuildings whose function remains uncertain. suggesting adaptations to shifting labour demands, environmental pressures, or economic fluctuations that rarely enter formal historical accounts. In the upper city, the remnants of temples and administrative buildings stand on platforms cut into bedrock, their placement aligned with both topography and earlier sacred spaces, and beneath one sanctuary's pavement, excavators found a sequence of older fills containing mixed ceramics from disparate cultural phases, raising questions about whether earlier ritual sites were intentionally incorporated into later constructions, a practice not uncommon in antiquity, yet difficult to trace with precision when stratigraphy has been reworked by centuries of erosion. And throughout the Acropolis, reused stones bearing weathered inscriptions or faint relief, carving hint at structures whose original context is lost, their repurposing complicating efforts to reconstruct a clear architectural sequence. Several partially exposed walls diverge from the dominant cardinal orientation of Roman design, suggesting that earlier street alignments or property boundaries influenced later development. And in the gaps between these walls lie traces of domestic debris, burnt seed, animal bone, shell fragments, whose analysis reveals dietary habits shaped by both riverine and maritime ecosystems, a blend that underscores the unique environmental niche Lixus occupied. Yet even with this wealth of data, certain elements resist easy interpretation. A cluster of circular features near the lower terrace appears too large for hearths and too shallow for storage pits, leaving their precise purpose uncertain. Stone alignments beneath one later building do not match any known plan and may represent a short-lived construction phase. And the distribution of imported ceramics fluctuates in ways that do not align neatly with established trade patterns, perhaps reflecting local preferences or episodic access to maritime networks. None of these irregularities imply extraordinary events, yet collectively they reveal how Lixus evolved through choices and circumstances not always captured by written sources, leaving subtle gaps that modern researchers continue to explore. Environmental studies indicate shifts in the river's course over time, episodes of flooding that deposited layers of silt across parts of the lower city, and gradual estuary infill that altered harbour conditions, prompting adjustments in settlement layout and industrial activity. And this interplay of human planning and natural change complicates attempts to assign firm dates to certain phases, as sediment movement may have obscured or redistributed evidence. Still, the overarching narrative that emerges is one of continual negotiation between land, water, and culture, a process that produced a city both resilient and mutable, shaped by its strategic location, yet vulnerable to the shifting contours of the estuary. As evening light settles on the broken theatre steps and the quiet gardens that now occupy ancient blocks, Lixus feels suspended between clarity and enigma, its archaeological record rich yet uneven, its chronology well documented yet punctuated by small uncertainties that invite thoughtful inquiry rather than speculation. And in that tension between what is known and what remains just beyond reach, lies a quiet suggestion that the earliest motivations for choosing this site, whether tied to ritual, resource, or vantage, may still be partially hidden beneath layers of later construction, awaiting careful excavation and interpretation, leaving Lixus to stand as a testament to the long continuum of human settlement on Morocco's Atlantic frontier and to the subtle mysteries that persist even in places where history seems extensively written. Megaliths of Mazzora. On a quiet rise above the rolling plains of northern Morocco, where the wind moves in long unbroken sweeps across fields of grain and wild grass, the megaliths of Mazzora form a ring of weathered standing stones, encircling a low earthen tumulus, their rough surfaces catching the shifting light, as though marking the rhythm of centuries rather than any single moment in the past. And when approached from the narrow track that winds uphill, the arrangement comes gradually into focus, 167 stones in varying heights, many leaning slightly, some fractured, others still firmly rooted, creating an enduring geometry that feels deliberate, yet softened by time. Its scale large enough to command attention, yet restrained compared to the grand megalithic assemblages of Europe, suggesting a local tradition shaped by regional needs rather than monumental excess. Excavations over the past century have revealed that the central mound likely functioned as a burial monument associated with a powerful community of the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, though the precise cultural context remains debated, as pottery fragments and lithic tools found nearby offer a broad chronological range rather than a tight sequence, leaving scholars to piece together the site's origins through comparative analysis with other North African tumuli and stone circles, whose forms echo similar patterns of alignment, spacing, and symbolic placement. Yet even within this framework, Mazzora contains quiet inconsistencies. Some stones appear to have been re-erected in antiquity using different packing materials than their neighbours. The circle's diameter is not perfectly uniform, widening toward one arc in a way that suggests either deliberate asymmetry or later subsidence. And in the soil around several of the larger uprights, researchers detected microscopic traces of burning that could indicate ritual activity or simply the byproduct of nearby habitation, the context still uncertain. And as investigators map the distribution of stones, they note subtle variations in lithology, with some monoliths sourced locally, while others appear to originate from quarries at a distance, a pattern that suggests a coordinated effort in transport, but leaves open questions about why certain stones were chosen over others, whether for symbolic association, structural performance, or availability during different phases of construction. The tumulus itself, partially excavated yet still largely sealed beneath protective layers of earth, contains a sequence of deposits that hint at multiple episodes of use. Intermittent interments, possible reconfigurations of the mound's outer slope, and the placement of grave goods, now too fragmentary to link with specific cultural groups. And these phases of activity introduce a complexity that challenges early interpretations of the monument as a single event construction, instead suggesting a site that matured over generations, its significance evolving alongside shifts in social organisation and regional interaction. At the northeastern edge of the circle, a cluster of smaller stones follows an arc slightly offset from the main ring, their orientation raising the possibility of a subsidiary feature or an earlier boundary now overshadowed by the final alignment. Though erosion and later agricultural disturbance obscure the precise relationship, leaving archaeologists cautious in drawing conclusions. Similarly, a shallow linear depression running toward the tumulus has been interpreted variously as a processional path, a drainage channel, or the remnant of a trench used during construction, each explanation plausible yet incomplete. The true nature of this feature still open to interpretation in light of limited excavation. And as the sun crosses the sky, casting elongated shadows between the stones, the ring takes on an almost astronomical clarity, prompting comparisons to megalithic traditions where alignments with solstices or cardinal directions played a role. Yet, at Mazzora, the evidence remains inconclusive. While some stones appear to mark directional axes, others do not conform, and the slight irregularities in spacing challenge any firm hypothesis of intentional celestial design, leading researchers to consider a broader spectrum of possibilities, from territorial demarcation to ceremonial gathering space, each grounded in regional patterns but none definitively proven. Soil analyses around the circumference reveal pollen signatures indicating episodic vegetation changes, suggesting that the surroundings oscillated between open grassland and denser shrub cover during the monument's active use. Environmental shifts that may have influenced how the site was experienced or accessed, yet these variations do not point to dramatic ecological disruption, instead aligning with natural climatic rhythms of the region. Below the tumulus, geophysical surveys detect faint anomalies, subtle differences in density that could mark additional structural features or natural variations in sediment compaction. And though excavators proceed with caution, these signals remind researchers that the mound's interior may hold details not yet uncovered, perhaps clarifying how the monument transitioned through its construction phases. And in the broader landscape, less conspicuous stones scattered downslope may represent outliers, waypoints, or remnants of dismantled features, though centuries of land use have blurred their original context. When viewed from a distance, the entire complex feels integrated with the surrounding terrain, its elevated position granting lines of sight toward distant hills that once formed natural boundaries between communities. And this vantage lends weight to theories that Mazzora's builders selected the location for both symbolic and practical reasons, situating the monument at a point where social, territorial, and environmental considerations intersected. And yet, despite all this, small uncertainties remain. Variations in construction material that do not align with known quarry sequences, interruptions in the stone ring that may signify later removal or earlier modification, and inconclusive links between the tumulus and the ring's outermost arc. Features that, while not extraordinary, complicate efforts to produce a definitive narrative of the monument's purpose. As dusk descends, and the stones take on deeper hues, the circle seems to contract into the hill, its presence quiet but persistent, inviting contemplation rather than conclusions. And in this soft ambiguity lies the enduring resonance of Mazzora, not as an enigma demanding resolution, but as a patient witness to long cycles of human presence, its scattered clues suggesting that the story of early societies in this region may include a chapter not yet fully resolved, one whose subtle traces remain embedded in the soil between the stones, awaiting careful interpretation by those who continue to study this ancient ring on the windswept rise above the plains. Kell Muna, where the valleys of the eastern High Atlas narrow into steep corridors carved by seasonal torrents, the rock-cut fort above Kell Muna emerges from the rose-coloured cliffs in a series of weathered chambers and defensive voids, its openings arranged with a restraint that mirrors the austere geology around them, so that from a distance the structure appears less built than revealed, as though the mountain itself offered its flanks to human hands, seeking refuge in a contested landscape. And when one approaches by the winding footpath that rises above terraced gardens and dry riverbeds, the fort resolves into a constellation of interconnected cavities, some hewn with deliberate masonry edges, others following the natural fissures of the cliff, creating a hybrid architecture that reflects both careful planning and opportunistic adaptation, its form shaped as much by the limitations of rock as by strategic intent. Early surveys suggest the complex evolved over multiple phases, each carving episode responding to shifting patterns of settlement, regional tension, and seasonal movement across the valleys. Yet the absence of extensive written documentation forces archaeologists to rely on clues embedded in the stone itself. Chisel marks that vary in width and depth hint at differing tool types or work crews. Soot-darkened ceilings indicate periods of prolonged occupation, and the remains of rudimentary post sockets carved into ledges suggest suspended platforms or wooden partitions now long vanished, their original configurations difficult to reconstruct. While local tradition ties elements of the fort to medieval defensive networks, pottery fragments recovered from sheltered pockets near the entrance reveal a chronological range broader than expected. Some pieces pointing toward earlier occupation by groups who may have used these cavities for storage, temporary shelter, or lookout positions before the more structured defensive adaptation took shape. And yet, the evidence remains fragmentary, leaving open the question of whether the earliest inhabitants carved intentionally or expanded natural hollows over time, slowly transforming an irregular geological shelter into a more formal stronghold. Within the interior, the chambers follow a surprisingly consistent logic. Narrow passages linking larger rooms, vantage apertures cut to monitor the valley floor, and vertical shafts whose purpose remains uncertain but may relate to ventilation or controlled access. Yet small variations complicate interpretation. One corridor abruptly widens before narrowing again, suggesting a partially abandoned modification. Another terminates in a blind alcove that bears no clear relationship to the rest of the layout, its function unknown. And in certain upper chambers, the walls exhibit smoothed surfaces inconsistent with the rougher toolwork elsewhere, hinting at a period of refinement or reoccupation by a group with different aesthetic or functional priorities. Outside, the cliff face preserves faint traces of steps and ledges that no longer connect cleanly, likely once part of an intricate access system used to control movement in and out of the fort. And the presence of collapsed rocks below suggests episodes of seismic activity or prolonged erosion that altered the approach, complicating attempts to determine the fort's original entry sequence. Environmental studies indicate fluctuations in precipitation across the centuries, and these climatic shifts may have influenced settlement density in the valley, altering the fort's role from refuge to watchpost to seasonal storage site. Each phase leaving only partial signatures, difficult to disentangle across the eroded stratigraphy. On the plateau above, scattered stone alignments and remnants of small enclosures point to temporary encampments or herding stations, and their proximity to the rock-cut chambers has prompted speculation that the fort may have served a broader network of pastoral communities who relied on elevated shelters during periods of tension or transhumance, though no single set of remains is conclusive, and the relationship between surface features and carved architecture remains open to careful interpretation. Faint red pigment found on an interior wall has been studied extensively, its composition consistent with natural iron oxide used across the region, yet the incomplete patterning makes it unclear whether it once formed a symbolic marking, a simple utilitarian stain, or the remnant of a more elaborate surface treatment. And this ambiguity echoes throughout the site, where small anomalies accumulate but seldom resolve into definitive narratives. In one chamber, a low bench carved from bedrock suggests a place of rest or observation, while a shallow basin nearby hints at water storage or ritual use, though the absence of associated artifacts limits conclusions. Similarly, a narrow vertical slit overlooking the valley seems ideally positioned for surveillance, yet its angle is slightly misaligned with the main approach route, leading researchers to consider whether changing pathways or natural erosion altered the original sightline. And across the complex, charcoal deposits suitable for radiocarbon analysis offer dates that cluster in several distinct periods rather than a single continuous occupation, indicating that the fort may have been used episodically, activated when circumstances required, then left dormant until renewed need drew people back to its heights. As the afternoon sun slides behind the ridge, shadows lengthen across the carved openings, emphasizing the interplay between deliberate human shaping and the mountain's own irregular contours. And in this convergence lies the site's quiet intrigue. Each chamber holds evidence of practical decision-making, protection from heat, vantage over the valley, exploitation of natural fractures, yet the overall plan remains slightly elusive, neither fully military nor purely domestic, suggesting a multifunctional role that evolved over time, guided by pressures and opportunities not fully captured in surviving archaeological traces. Erosion has softened edges, obscured pathways, and removed the wooden elements that once completed the architecture. And this partial preservation creates spaces where interpretation must be approached with care, acknowledging the limits of material evidence while recognizing the continuity of human presence across the region's long history. Evening settles with a muted glow against the cliff, and the fort blends once more into the geological backdrop, its openings dim but still perceptible, marking a place where generations address the challenges of terrain and circumstance, leaving behind a structure whose incomplete record hints at a missing thread in the broader story of settlement and resilience in the High Atlas, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a subtle reminder that even well-studied landscapes hold small, unresolved chapters waiting in the quiet along the rock-cut walls. Tinmel Mosque, high on a quiet shoulder of the High Atlas, where the mountains gather themselves into long ridges of pale limestone and shadow. The Tinmel Mosque settles into view with a gravity that feels both architectural and topographic, its softened silhouette rising from the valley floor in a series of muted plains that echo the surrounding slopes. And as early light brushes the flanks of its buttressed walls, the monument reveals traces of a past shaped by devotion, dynastic ambition, and the shifting contours of a region long defined by movement across rugged terrain. Though the mosque is remembered as a central monument of the Almohad movement, the landscape around it preserves subtler layers of habitation, scattered terrace remains, clustered foundations eroded nearly level with the earth, and faint irrigation traces that may predate the structure itself, suggesting that this valley held strategic and symbolic importance before its transformation into a dynastic heartland. And these understated features complicate the narrative that Tinmel emerged suddenly as a monumental expression of reformist ideology. Within the mosque's sandstone and lime-plastered walls, the interplay of shadow and structure reveals a nuanced architectural intelligence, arcades arranged in quiet rhythm, horseshoe and pointed arches alternating in measured succession, and mihrab geometry that converges in carefully carved stucco, now eroded but still discernible, each element contributing to a design that reflects both regional craft traditions and the standardized aesthetic the Almohads later extended across their territories. Yet beneath this architectural clarity lie subtle irregularities that capture archaeological curiosity. Variations in mortar composition at the base of certain piers, suggesting phases of repair or reinforcement, asymmetries in the thickness of outer walls that do not fully align with the mosque's otherwise rigorous plan, and traces of foundational levelling that imply the builders negotiated uneven terrain more extensively than once assumed. Outside the main prayer hall, open courtyards reveal soil layers containing ceramics of mixed date, some older than the mosque's construction, and the distribution of these artifacts hints at earlier forms of settlement or ritual gathering whose contours remain incomplete, their patterns interrupted by centuries of rebuilding and erosion. Researchers studying the mosque's orientation note its slight deviation from later standardized Qibla alignments, a variation that may reflect regional survey methods or theological interpretations of the early Almohad period. Though the exact reasoning remains unsettled, its explanation residing somewhere between practical constraints and evolving liturgical norms. As one moves along the exterior, the massive buttresses, hallmarks of Almohad architectural style, cast deep vertical shadows across the facade. Yet even these monumental elements show evidence of subtle modification. Stone inserts in their lower courses differ slightly in texture from those above, suggesting either a repair campaign or a construction adjustment made, as the building settled into the valley floor. And while historic sources emphasize Tinmel's political and spiritual centrality, the archaeological record offers glimpses of a more dynamic setting, stone alignments on the adjacent terraces that may have supported ancillary structures, fragments of roofing tile inconsistent with the mosque's original design, and a partially buried threshold whose orientation suggests an earlier entrance pathway now disrupted by shifting topography. Geophysical surveys conducted across the surrounding plain reveal faint anomalies beneath the soil, potential foundations or property boundaries whose relationship to the mosque remains speculative. And though none of these features point to dramatic revelations, they hint at a broader landscape of activity, in which the mosque functioned not in isolation, but as part of a more complex settlement pattern that has yet to be fully mapped. Environmental studies show that the valley experienced significant shifts in water flow over the centuries, with periods of reduced snowmelt altering the viability of terraced agriculture, and these fluctuations may have influenced both the mosque's maintenance cycles and the surrounding habitation density, though the precise chronology of these shifts is still being refined through sediment core analysis. Inside, the fragmentary stucco inscriptions, some barely legible, record theological messages central to the Almohad movement. Yet the surviving fragments reveal inconsistencies in carving style, perhaps indicating multiple workshops or artisans working concurrently, their differing techniques leaving subtle variations in line and depth that complicate stylistic classification. And high on the internal walls, traces of red pigment hint at surface treatments now lost, though whether these were decorative, functional, or symbolic remains uncertain, the faintness of the residue preventing definitive interpretation. The mosque's partially collapsed roof, reconstructed in recent times, once relied on a system of timber beams whose original distribution is still debated due to limited surviving anchors, and questions persist regarding whether the Almohads adopted a roof form uniquely adapted to the climatic conditions of this valley, or one that aligned with architectural norms from their coastal and urban centres. As sunlight shifts westward, the mosque's interior gradually fills with a cool, diffused glow that accentuates the quiet mass of its columns and arcades. And in this changing light, the building's layered history becomes more apparent. Moments of renovation indicated by small discrepancies in plaster finish, discrete expansions or contractions of interior space suggested by irregular bonding lines, and signs of later reuse visible in floor patches where tiles have been replaced or repositioned. And as evening gathers, Tinmel appears to fold into the valley, its imposing walls softened by shadow, leaving only the rhythm of its arcades and the alignment of its mihrab clearly legible against the dusk. A reminder that while its origins are broadly documented, numerous details of its earliest phases remain only partly understood. These uncertainties do not undermine the mosque's historical significance, but instead add texture to its story, hinting at a quieter chapter of development, one shaped by environmental adaptation, incremental construction decisions, and the lived experience of communities whose presence predated and accompanied the Almohad rise, suggesting that beneath the monument's confident form lies a more gradual, layered evolution still awaiting its full articulation in the ongoing study of this highland sanctuary. Sijilmasa ruins. Where the Ziz River threads its way through the palm groves of the Tafilalt oasis, the ruins of Sijilmasa lie scattered across a broad sunlit plain, their low earthen mounds, collapsed enclosure walls, and faint street grids emerging only gradually from the pale soil, so that the once renowned medieval trading city feels less like a vanished metropolis than a series of murmurs beneath the desert surface, each contour hinting at a structure whose full form has long since returned to dust. Approaching from the north, the landscape appears deceptively empty, yet as the ground begins to rise, adobe fragments, pottery shards, and remnants of irrigation channels come into view, arranged in an expanse that stretches far beyond the visible ruins, suggesting a settlement whose scale and complexity exceeded earlier counts, though its outline today is softened by wind, seasonal flooding, and centuries of abandonment. Medieval chroniclers emphasized Sijilmasa's prominence as a gateway between Maghrebi markets and trans-Saharan caravans, describing walls, markets, and fortified districts. Yet the archaeological record reveals a more nuanced evolution. Layers of mud brick fortifications rebuilt multiple times, residential blocks showing phases of expansion and contraction, and workshops whose shifting locations implied changes in trade patterns and economic regulation, each modification adding complexity to a site already shaped by the volatility of desert watercourses. Excavations near the central zone uncovered segments of massive walls, whose varying thickness suggests different construction episodes, and within their collapsed sections lie fragments of glazed ceramics, bronze fittings, and charred organic remains that together sketch a portrait of urban life at once vibrant and vulnerable. For the presence of burned layers at several points hints at destructive events, perhaps conflict, perhaps accidental fire, though their irregular distribution suggests a pattern more episodic than catastrophic. Beyond these central remains, linear depressions trace the paths of ancient canals, their alignment shifting subtly across strata as the oasis's hydrology changed, indicating that Sijilmasa's engineers continually adapted water management systems to the fluctuations of the Ziz, a relationship that could be both sustaining and precarious. For sudden floods may have buried parts of the city in silt, while drought years forced adjustments in settlement density along the irrigated lanes. To the east, clusters of foundations exhibit an organisation distinct from the rectilinear streets nearer the core, their looser pattern hinting at peripheral quarters, caravan encampments, or semi-permanent habitation zones used by traders awaiting safe passage across the Sahara. Yet despite the promising distribution of hearth debris and metalworking slag, the interpretation of these spaces remains incomplete, complicated by erosion and modern land use that has disturbed their upper layers. Small anomalies persist throughout the site. Sections of wall rebuilt with different brick proportions, suggesting repairs by groups with varying construction methods. Pottery assemblages containing forms uncommon in the central Maghreb, raising questions about localized preferences or undocumented trade routes. And isolated stone alignments, whose placement defies the grid-like logic of the main urban sectors, possibly remnants of earlier pre-Islamic occupation or boundary markers reused within the expanding medieval landscape. At the northern extremity, where the desert plain slopes toward an older channel of the river, a series of low platforms preserve traces of what may have been industrial installations, perhaps tanning pits or dyeing basins, yet the lack of clear stratigraphic separation makes their function uncertain, leaving open the possibility that these features represent successive reuses of the same ground for differing economic purposes. Meanwhile, the western zone, once interpreted as a necropolis, has revealed overlapping graves from multiple periods, their orientations subtly shifting through time, suggesting evolving communal practices and perhaps changes in population composition, though the variability remains within the range of known Islamic funerary customs and adds breadth rather than contradiction to the city's record. Geophysical surveys across the untouched expanses detect faint geometric anomalies that hint at additional structures beyond the excavated areas. Yet the diffuse nature of these signals reflects both the fragility of mud brick architecture and the natural sedimentation that has smoothed the city into gentle undulations, making it difficult to determine whether these patterns represent domestic quarters, storage compounds, or simply the residue of eroded fortifications. Environmental studies of pollen and phytoliths recovered from occupation layers reveal alternating phases of agricultural intensity and decline, correlating with broader climatic fluctuations across the region. And these cycles may have shaped Sijilmasa's fortunes as much as its role in trans-Saharan commerce, influencing how densely the oasis could support inhabitants during times of economic expansion or strain. And within the central mounds, where the traces of market structures may once have stood, archaeologists have found subtle inconsistencies in floor levels and drainage design, suggesting serial renewals of commercial space as shifting caravan volumes, political control, and economic priorities redefined the city's internal organisation. Yet the absence of extensive surviving architecture means that these interpretations remain provisional, pieced together through soil composition, artifact density, and the faintest hints of foundation layout. As the sun begins to lower over the palm groves, shadows lengthen across the dispersed ruins, and the city's fragmented footprint becomes easier to sense than to see. The emptiness between structures, hinting at the possibility that Sijilmasa's full extent has yet to be delineated, its edges blurred by centuries of shifting sands and ephemeral floods. This uncertainty does not imply anything extraordinary, but rather reflects the inherent challenges of reconstructing a vast mud brick city, whose materials degrade readily under desert conditions, leaving archaeologists to interpret a palimpsest of partial remains that speak in subdued tones. And yet it is precisely within these quiet gaps, irregular alignments, mixed ceramic horizons, and faint geomagnetic traces, that the sense of an incomplete chapter resides, suggesting that Sijilmasa's role in connecting northern and Saharan worlds may be more complex than the surviving chronicles convey, and that its earliest developmental stages, perhaps modest, perhaps decentralized, are still only lightly sketched in the earth. When night approaches and the wind sweeps gently over the plain, the ruins appear to fold back into the oasis, leaving behind only the outlines of walls and the memory of a city whose layered story continues to emerge slowly, piece by careful piece, inviting further study into a past that remains both grounded and subtly unfinished beneath the desert's calm surface.